A broken racehorse, abandoned and scarred by betrayal, is sold for just $3. A woman with no horse experience decides to take him in, giving him a second chance. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you are watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. The autumn air carried the mingled scents of hay, leather, and hearty stews as Emily Mitchell wandered through the bustling Saturday market in Somerset Valley. At 62, she had recently retired from teaching and moved to this quiet corner of rural England, seeking a simpler life after her husband's passing. The horse section of the market was typically a place she avoided the noise and commotion often overwhelming. But today, something drew her there. Perhaps it was fate, or as she would later say, the whisper of an angel. That's when she saw him. In the far corner, away from the proudly displayed show horses and sturdy work animals, stood a bay gelding who seemed to be trying to disappear into the shadows of his makeshift stall. His coat, though dull and patchy, hinted at what must have once been a rich chocolate brown. His head hung low, but it wasn't the natural relaxed posture of a resting horse. It was the defeated stance of one who had given up. "Interested in that one, are you?" A gruff voice startled her. The seller, a weathered man in his 50s, approached with a knowing smirk. "Wouldn't bother if I were you, these damaged goods. Former racehorse, but he's got no spirit left. Probably only good for meat now." Emily felt her heart constrict at his callous words. Drawing closer to the stall, she noticed the scars, some old, some barely healed, crossing the horse's flanks. His ribs showed clearly beneath his hide and his eyes. Those eyes held a story of betrayal that broke her heart. "What's his name?" she asked softly. "Papers say Buck, but we just call him Buck." The seller shrugged. Previous owner was some hotshot trainer named James Reynolds. Horse got injured, lost a big race, and James didn't want him anymore. Been passed around since then. As if hearing his name, the horse lifted his head slightly. Emily met his gaze, and in that moment, something profound passed between them. Those weren't the eyes of a broken spirit. They were the eyes of someone waiting for a reason to trust again. "How much?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. The seller named a surprisingly low price, clearly eager to be rid of what he considered a lost cause. Emily's mind raced with practical concerns. She had some land, yes, and a small stable from the previous owners. But she hadn't planned on keeping horses. She had no experience beyond the riding lessons of her youth. But looking at Buck, she knew some decisions transcend practical considerations. "I'll take him," she said firmly, reaching for her checkbook. The seller's eyebrows shot up. "Lady, no offense, but do you know anything about handling troubled horses? This one's got issues. He spooks at shadows, won't let anyone near his head, and forget about riding him." Emily straightened her spine, channeling the authority she'd used for decades in her classroom. "What I know is that every living being deserves a chance at healing. He'll have that with me, whether he ever carries a rider again or not." As she completed the paperwork, an elderly woman who had been watching the exchange approached. "You're either very brave or very foolish," she said, but her eyes were kind. "I'm Claire Thompson, the local veterinarian. Here's my card. You're going to need help with this one." Emily accepted the card gratefully. "I'm Emily Mitchell, and maybe I am foolish, but..." She glanced at Buck, who was watching their interaction with cautious interest. Sometimes the foolish choice is the right one. As she waited for the transport trailer she'd arranged, Emily stood by Buck's stall, speaking to him softly. She didn't touch him. Something told her he wasn't ready for that, but she wanted him to know her voice, to begin understanding that not all humans brought pain. "You're coming home with me, dear one," she murmured, "and whatever happened before, whatever made you lose faith in people, that's over now. We're going to write a new story together." The journey home was a test of patience. Buck refused to enter the trailer until Emily had spent nearly an hour just standing quietly beside it, humming old lullabies her mother used to sing. When he finally stepped inside, his whole body trembled. "Poor love," whispered Maggie, the trailer driver who'd been recommended by Claire. "Someone's done a real number on him. See those marks around his muzzle? Those are from a cruel bit, that is. And those scars on his legs? Whip marks. I'd bet my pension on it." Emily's small property, Meadowbrook Cottage, sat on 3 acres of gentle rolling hills. The previous owners had maintained a tidy 2-stall stable with the attached paddock, though it had stood empty for months. Emily had spent the previous week cleaning it out, somehow knowing she'd need it someday. Getting Buck settled proved another challenge. He backed out of the trailer like he expected to be struck, his nostrils flaring at every new scent and sound. The setting sun cast long shadows across the paddock, and each one seemed to startle him. "I'll leave you to it then," Maggie said, handing Emily a bundle. "Claire asked me to drop these off, some basic supplies to get you started. She'll be by tomorrow morning to check him over." Alone with Buck, Emily set about making his stall comfortable. She spread fresh straw, filled his water bucket, and placed hay in the corner. All the while, she kept up a gentle stream of conversation. "You know, I used to tell my students that everyone has a story," she said, measuring out a small portion of feed. "Some stories are happy from the start, and some take a dark turn along the way. But the wonderful thing about stories, Buck, is that they can always change direction." The horse watched her from the paddock, refusing to enter the stable. As darkness fell, a light rain began to fall, but still he stood there, as if uncertain he had permission to seek shelter. Emily pulled up an old garden chair under the stable's overhang. "I'll just sit here then, shall I? Keep you company until you're ready." Hours passed, the rain grew heavier, and Emily wrapped herself in an old horse blanket she'd found in the tack room. Her bones ached from sitting still in the damp air, but she refused to leave. Around midnight, something remarkable happened. Buck took one tentative step toward the stable, then another. Emily held her breath, continuing to speak softly. "That's it, love. No one's going to hurt you here. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Step by step, Buck made his way into the stable. He didn't enter the stall. Instead, he positioned himself just inside the door where he could see both Emily and the exit. But he was under shelter, and Emily counted that as a victory. "Good boy," she whispered, fighting back tears. "Such a brave, good boy." She remained in her chair until dawn, dozing occasionally but mostly watching Buck. Sometimes he would startle at a distant sound, an owl's hoot or a fox's bark, and his whole body would tense as if expecting punishment. Each time, Emily's soft voice would bring him back from the edge of panic. As the first light of morning painted the sky in pale pink, Emily heard a car pulling up her gravel drive. Claire's weathered Land Rover came into view, and the veterinarian emerged carrying her medical bag. "You've been out here all night, haven't you?" Claire asked, taking in Emily's damp clothes and tired eyes. "He needed to know he wasn't alone," Emily replied simply. Claire's expression softened. "You know, when I gave you my card yesterday, I thought you'd need help with the horse. But now I'm thinking maybe you're exactly what he needs." She paused, studying Buck's posture. "Though I suspect there's trouble ahead, horses like this, with his kind of history, sometimes the past comes looking for them." Emily straightened in her chair, feeling steel enter her spine despite her exhaustion. "Well then, the past will find him well protected." Over the next few weeks, Emily fell into a new rhythm of life, centered around Buck's healing. Claire's examination had revealed the full extent of his physical injuries: improperly healed muscle tears, signs of old fractures, and chronic pain in his left hind leg. But it was the emotional scars that concerned her most. "Records show he was once quite successful on the racing circuit," Claire explained one morning, sharing tea with Emily in the stable yard while Buck grazed cautiously nearby. Won several prestigious races under James Reynolds' training. Then something changed. Emily had begun researching James Reynolds, and what she found disturbed her. "There were rumors, weren't there, about his training methods?" Claire nodded grimly. "Rumors, yes, but never enough proof for formal charges. Horses would disappear from his stable after poor performances, only to turn up months later in sorry states. But James had friends in high places, and money has a way of buying silence." As if sensing they were discussing his past, Buck lifted his head, ears pricked forward. In the 3 weeks since his arrival, he'd begun to show small signs of trust. He would now eat while Emily was present, and occasionally he'd approach the fence when she sat reading in the paddock. "The breakthrough came yesterday," Emily said, smiling at the memory. "I was humming that old song, Danny Boy, and he walked right up and put his nose against my shoulder. Just for a moment, mind you. But still," Claire beamed, "that's wonderful progress." "But Emily," her expression grew serious, "I've heard whispers that James has been asking about him." Someone at the market recognized Buck, and word got back. Emily felt her chest tighten. He has no legal claim. I have the sale papers. Legal claims aren't always what matter in cases like this, Claire warned. James has a reputation for taking what he wants. That afternoon, as Emily went about her stable chores, she noticed Buck was more agitated than usual. His ears kept swiveling toward the road, and he stayed close to the stable instead of grazing. It wasn't until she heard the sound of an approaching vehicle that she understood why. A sleek black SUV pulled up to her gate. Two men emerged, one elderly and distinguished looking, the other younger and athletic. The older man approached the fence with the confidence of someone used to getting his way. "Mrs. Mitchell?" His voice was smooth as silk. "I'm James Reynolds. I understand you've acquired one of my former horses." Emily moved to stand between James and Buck's paddock. Former being the operative word. "Mr. Reynolds, Buck belongs here now." James's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come now, surely we can discuss this reasonably. That horse represents years of breeding and training investment. I'm prepared to offer you twice what you paid for him." "He's not for sale," Emily replied firmly. At any price, the younger man stepped forward, his stance threatening. "Listen, Lady Dash." But James held up a hand. "Another time, perhaps, when you've had a chance to think it over." His gaze shifted to Buck, who had retreated to the furthest corner of the paddock. "He looks different, softer." "That won't do at all." After they left, Emily called Claire immediately. "We need to do more than just protect him," she said. "We need to expose what James did, not just to Buck, but to all his horses." "It won't be easy," Claire cautioned, "but I might know someone who can help." "Ever heard of Laura Blackwood?" She's an investigative journalist who specializes in animal welfare cases. That night, Emily sat in Buck's stable long after dark, making notes in her journal. She documented every scar, every fearful reaction, every sign of past abuse. If James wanted a fight, she would be ready. "We're going to tell your story, brave boy," she whispered to Buck, who had taken to standing closer to her each evening. "And this time, justice will be on our side." Laura Blackwood arrived at Meadowbrook Cottage 3 days later, a whirlwind of energy despite her small frame. Her reputation preceded her. She had exposed numerous cases of animal cruelty in the racing industry, earning both acclaim and enemies. "The key," Laura explained, spreading her research across Emily's kitchen table, "is connecting the dots. James's horses show a pattern. They start successful, then suddenly decline after about 3 years. Those that don't perform are discarded, often with similar injuries to Buck's." Emily poured more tea as they pored over racing records, veterinary reports, and photographs. Through the kitchen window, she could see Buck in his paddock, attempting his first tentative trot since arriving. His movement was stiff but determined. "Look at this," Laura pointed to a document. 5 years ago, a horse named Midnight Runner disappeared from James's stables after losing a major race. 3 months later, he was found abandoned at a livestock auction, showing signs of severe abuse. But the investigation was dropped mysteriously. "The same pattern as Buck," Emily murmured. "But why hasn't anyone stopped him?" Laura's expression darkened. "Money talks. James is connected to some of the biggest names in racing. Plus he's clever, keeps changing veterinarians, moves horses between different properties. But," she smiled grimly, "he's never faced someone like you before." Over the next few weeks, they built their case. Claire contributed detailed medical records documenting Buck's injuries. Former stable hands, protected by anonymity, began coming forward with testimonies about James's cruel training methods. Laura's investigation uncovered financial records suggesting bribes to racing officials. Meanwhile, Buck continued his slow journey toward trust. One misty morning, as Emily sat reading in her usual spot by the paddock, something extraordinary happened. Buck approached and, for the first time, allowed her to touch his neck. The moment her hand made contact, they both trembled, him from lingering fear, her from profound emotion. "Oh, my brave boy," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "We're getting there, aren't we?" But James wasn't idle. Strange cars began driving past the property at odd hours. Anonymous phone calls threatened legal action. Then one morning, Emily found her paddock gate open, though thankfully Buck had chosen to stay near his stable. "He's trying to intimidate you," Laura said when Emily called her. "But we're almost ready. We have enough evidence now to take this to the racing board and the police." That evening, as storm clouds gathered overhead, Emily received an unexpected visitor. It was one of James's former grooms, a young woman named Rebecca. "I can't stay long," Rebecca said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "But there's something you need to know. The night before Buck's last race, I saw James inject him with something. The horse was fighting fit, but James needed him to lose something about betting patterns. When Buck ran anyway and nearly won James, she choked up. The beating was so bad. I quit the next day, but I've never forgiven myself for not speaking up." Rebecca's testimony was the final piece they needed. Laura prepared to publish her exposé, while Claire documented Rebecca's statement for the authorities. But James had one last card to play. The next morning, Emily found a legal notice in her mailbox. James was suing for Buck's return, claiming the sale had been conducted fraudulently. "He's desperate," Laura assured her over the phone. "He knows we're close to exposing everything. But Emily, be careful. Men like James are most dangerous when cornered." That night, as thunder rolled across the valley, Emily stayed in the stable with Buck. The storm seemed to mirror the turbulence ahead, but as she watched her beloved horse standing strong despite his fears, she felt her own resolve strengthen. "Tomorrow we fight back," she told him, running her hand along his now gleaming coat. "Tomorrow we make sure no horse suffers like you did ever again." The morning of the hearing dawned crisp and clear. The local courthouse, a Jamesian building of red brick and dignity, seemed to loom larger than usual as Emily walked up its worn steps. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered: Claire, Laura, Rebecca, and to her surprise, several faces she recognized from the local horse community. "Word spreads fast in small towns," Claire explained, squeezing Emily's hand. "Everyone's tired of James's shadow over the racing world." Inside the courtroom, James sat with his expensive legal team, looking immaculate in a tailored suit. His confident smirk faltered slightly when Laura began setting up her evidence presentation. Thick folders of documentation spanning years of suspected abuse. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Sophia Brockworth, called the court to order. James's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of a respected trainer whose valuable property had been sold without proper authority. "My client has invested years and considerable resources in this animal," the lawyer argued smoothly. "The sale was conducted by a temporary caretaker who had no right to transfer ownership." But when it was their turn, Laura's presentation changed everything. Photograph after photograph showed the progression of abuse in James's stable. Rebecca's testimony, supported by dated photographs she'd secretly taken, detailed the systematic cruelty. Claire presented her veterinary assessment of Buck's injuries, matching them to specific abusive training practices. "Your Honor," Laura concluded, "this isn't just about one horse. This is about a pattern of abuse that has gone unchecked for too long. Mrs. Mitchell didn't just buy a horse. She saved him from a system that failed to protect him." During a brief recess, Emily stepped outside for air. To her amazement, more people had gathered. Former jockeys, stable hands, local farmers. Some held signs supporting Buck's cause. A local news crew had arrived. Back inside, Judge Brockworth's expression had grown increasingly severe as she reviewed the evidence. When James was called to testify, his usual polish cracked under her direct questioning. "Mr. Reynolds," she asked, "can you explain these betting records showing substantial wagers against your own horse on the day of his final race?" James's face reddened. That's not relevant to the ownership dispute. On the contrary," the judge replied, "it speaks directly to your character and your treatment of these animals." The final blow came when the prosecution presented evidence of similar patterns with other horses from James's stable. The judge's decision was unequivocal. "Not only do I find in favor of Mrs. Mitchell retaining ownership of the horse known as Buck," Judge Brockworth declared, "but I am referring this substantial evidence of animal cruelty and race fixing to the proper authorities for criminal investigation." James stormed out of the courthouse, followed by a barrage of questions from awaiting reporters. But Emily barely noticed. Her thoughts were already with Buck, waiting in his peaceful paddock at home. That evening, as the sun set over Meadowbrook Cottage, Emily sat in her usual spot by the paddock. Buck stood beside her, his head lowered to her shoulder in what had become their evening ritual. His eyes, once dull with fear, now held a gentle wisdom. "We did it, boy," she whispered, stroking his neck. "But this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Already her phone had been buzzing with messages. Other horse owners seeking advice, rescue organizations asking for support. local authorities requesting her input on animal welfare guidelines. "I think," she told Buck, "we might need to make room for a few more friends here at Meadowbrook." 1 year later, Meadowbrook Cottage had transformed. What began with one rescued horse had blossomed into something extraordinary. With the help of community donations and grants sparked by Laura's continued coverage, Emily had expanded the property to include 6 more stalls and additional paddocks. On this particular spring morning, Emily stood at her kitchen window, cradling her morning tea as she watched the sunrise paint the paddocks in golden light. Buck, now healthy and confident, led his small herd in their morning routine. Beside him grazed Hope, a former circus pony with anxiety issues, Thunder, an ex-racehorse who'd been saved from slaughter, and 3 other rescued horses, each with their own story of survival. "Quite a change from last year," Claire remarked, arriving for her weekly veterinary checkup. She'd become more than just a vet. She was Emily's closest friend and partner in running what they now called Meadowbrook Sanctuary. "Sometimes I can hardly believe it myself," Emily replied, pulling on her boots. "Did you see the latest update about James?" Claire nodded grimly. 10 years in prison for animal cruelty and race fixing. Laura's article really opened the floodgates. Investigators found evidence of abuse going back 15 years. As they walked to the stables, they passed a new addition to the property, a small classroom space where Emily had begun hosting educational programs for local schools. Her years of teaching experience had found a new purpose, helping children understand the importance of animal welfare and responsible care. Morning, Mrs. Mitchell called Ava, their teenage volunteer. She was one of several local young people who now helped at the sanctuary learning about horse care and rehabilitation. Buck's been showing off his new trick. Indeed, Buck had developed a remarkable ability to sense when new rescue horses were struggling to adjust. He would stand beside them, offering silent companionship until they began to trust their new surroundings. The transformation in him was nothing short of miraculous. "We've got that group from the senior center coming today," Emily reminded Claire. "Their therapy program has been wonderful, watching the elderly connect with the horses, sharing their own stories." The sanctuary had become more than just a haven for abused horses. It was a place of healing for humans too. Weekly visits from retirement homes brought elderly residents who found joy in gentle grooming sessions. Veterans with PTSD found peace in the quiet company of understanding animals. Children with special needs blossomed through supervised interactions with the gentler horses. As they began their morning rounds, Emily paused at Buck's paddock. He approached immediately, nickering softly their morning greeting. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, and his eyes, once so haunted, now held a peaceful brightness. "Remember our first night together?" she asked him softly, stroking his forelock. "When I sat in that old chair in the rain, wondering if I was foolish to think I could help you." Buck pressed his muzzle against her shoulder, his usual gesture of affection. Behind him, the other horses grazed contentedly, each one a testament to the power of second chances. "Your mother would be so proud," Claire said quietly. "You mentioned once that she always told you to follow your heart, even when your head says you're being impractical." Emily smiled, remembering her mother's wisdom. She also used to say that love multiplies when you share it. I never understood that fully until now. The sound of approaching cars signaled the arrival of the day's visitors, the senior center group accompanied by their caregivers. Emily watched as elderly faces lit up at the sight of the horses, and she felt that familiar warmth in her heart. "Well," she said, straightening her shoulders, "shall we begin today's healing?" As she walked toward the parking area to greet her visitors, Emily reflected on how one decision, one moment of compassion for a wounded soul, had rippled outward to touch so many lives. Meadowbrook Sanctuary had become more than just a safe haven. It was a testament to the transformative power of love and second chances. Behind her, Buck watched with wise eyes, as if he too understood that their story had grown far beyond just the two of them. It had become a symphony of hope, played out in the daily miracles of healing and trust rebuilt, one gentle moment at a time. The horses rescued at Meadowbrook Sanctuary are now not just survivors, but symbols of hope, healing, and second chances in life. And perhaps the most important message from this story is, never give up. Sometimes it's our willingness to defy the odds that brings about the greatest miracles. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more inspiring videos. Share this story with your friends and family so we can spread love and care for all the creatures around us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.